I used to believe that if you loved someone enough, they wouldn't change. That love itself could hold a person steady like light caught inside glass. I met Daniel when I was 27, the same year I started my first job as a surgical nurse. He had just opened his own company, full of energy and impossible dreams. He carried himself with a kind of calm certainty that made people trust him. Once, after I helped a patient through a long night, he said, "You have hands that make people want to live." I remember blushing at the way he looked at me like he had already decided I was the rest of his story. We built a small life together. A rented apartment with white curtains, 2 mugs that never matched, laughter that filled the kitchen every Sunday morning. In those days, I thought happiness was something you could build carefully, like a house of glass, transparent, bright, safe from the wind. Then came the diagnosis. His kidneys were failing, quietly, like stars fading before dawn. The doctor spoke in numbers and probabilities, but all I heard was the word terminal. Daniel tried to smile, but there was fear behind his eyes, thin, sharp, and trembling. That night, while he sat at the window staring into the dark, I said the words before I even understood them. "If my body can save you, take what you need." People called me reckless. My mother cried. My friends begged me to think. But love, to me, was never logical. It was a promise you kept, even when it hurt. The morning of the surgery, the hospital lights were almost too bright. They painted everything sterile, almost holy. Daniel reached for my hand, his skin cold and damp, and whispered, "I owe you my life." I smiled through the mask, thinking that maybe this was what devotion meant: 2 hearts bound by the same rhythm, one body lending breath to another. When I woke in recovery, pain threaded through me like electricity, but I felt a strange peace. The house of glass still stood, I thought. The light had survived the storm. But later, when he didn't come that night, when the room filled only with the hum of the monitor and the smell of antiseptic, I felt a flicker of something unfamiliar. Not anger, not fear. Just a quiet, unspoken question. Love was supposed to make us whole. So why did I feel a small part of me had gone missing? I didn't know then that the moment I gave Daniel a part of my body was the same moment I began to lose him and to lose myself. If you enjoyed my story, you can leave a 1 in the comments. It lets me know these stories still mean something to you. And you, if you were in this person's place, what would you do? I'd truly love to hear your thoughts, so don't hesitate to share them below. I'm always curious to know what people feel, and I'd love to hear where you first came across this story or what made you stay until the end. And if stories like this one touch your heart, please like the video and subscribe to stay with me. There are many more stories waiting for you. Stories where, perhaps, you might find a part of yourself. For the first few weeks after the surgery, everything felt quiet, too quiet. Daniel recovered faster than anyone expected. His skin regained its color, his appetite returned, and the shadows under his eyes slowly disappeared. Every doctor said it was a miracle, and maybe it was. But I couldn't help wondering why that same miracle felt heavier inside me each day. He used to wake up before me, kiss my forehead, and make coffee just the way I liked it. After the transplant, he began waking earlier, leaving for walks before sunrise. The smell of coffee was replaced by the faint scent of antiseptic and something else distant. I told myself not to worry. Recovery changes people. Maybe he was just overwhelmed by surviving. He said he wanted to live more meaningfully. I believed that meant living together. But slowly, almost imperceptibly, he began to build a new life that didn't seem to include me. At first, it was small things: messages left unanswered, dinners postponed, his laughter somewhere I couldn't reach. When I spoke, his eyes drifted to the window, to the clock, anywhere but me. I'd ask, "Are you all right?" He'd nod, distracted, saying, "Just tired." The nights grew longer. The sound of the humidifier in our bedroom became my companion, its low hum like a heartbeat I could no longer share. Sometimes, I would lay my hand over the scar on my side, tracing the line that marked what I had given up. I had given him a piece of my body, something living, pulsing, and yet I had never felt him so far away. When he started going out more often, I didn't ask where. I told myself trust was love's highest form. But trust, I was beginning to realize, can also be blindness dressed as virtue. He'd come home late, smelling faintly of perfume, not mine. His explanations were smooth, rehearsed: meetings, clients, deadlines, the life of a man grateful to be alive. Sometimes he'd kiss my cheek, as if performing the gesture for memory's sake. The warmth never reached his eyes. There were mornings when I watched him button his shirt, his back turned to me. The light from the window hit his skin just where my kidney now worked inside him. It felt almost poetic, my life still beating quietly within a man who had already left me in every other way. Maya, my closest friend, came to visit one Sunday. She looked at me for a long time before she spoke. "You've lost weight," she said softly. "Are you sleeping?" I smiled, the practiced kind. "He's just figuring things out." Her expression didn't change. "Evelyn, you can't save someone who doesn't want to stay." Her words landed gently, but they pierced through the fog I had been hiding behind. I wanted to argue, to tell her she didn't understand. Instead, I poured her more tea, the silence stretching between us like a wall. That night, her voice echoed in my head long after she left. I stared at the ceiling, listening to the rain tap against the window, and I thought, what if she was right? There's a strange kind of loneliness that comes after you've saved someone's life. You think you've done the ultimate act of love, but then you realize love doesn't always return home. It wanders, it forgets, it changes shape. Daniel no longer touched me the way he used to. When he reached for me, it felt like obligation, not desire. The intimacy we once shared became a formality, a routine act of kindness to avoid confrontation. I told myself it was temporary, that marriages had seasons, that every winter eventually turns to spring. But deep down, I knew some winters never thaw. I started writing letters I never sent. Notes to myself, really. Day 42 after the surgery. He laughed at something on his phone for 10 minutes. I asked what it was. He said it was a meme. I smiled, too. I didn't ask again. Day 85. He forgot our dinner plans, said he had an urgent meeting, came home smelling like rain and roses. It hasn't rained all day. The human heart has its own way of preparing for heartbreak. It begins to whisper before it screams. By the 4th month, the tension between us was a silent presence in every room. At breakfast, his spoon clinked against the cup like a metronome, marking the distance between us. At night, he slept facing the other direction. When I reached for his hand, he pretended not to notice. Once, I caught my reflection in the hallway mirror and almost didn't recognize the woman staring back. Her eyes were tired, her lips pressed together as if holding back a truth too fragile to name. That was the moment I realized love can make you disappear long before it leaves. I tried to bring back the warmth. I cooked his favorite meals, left small notes in his pockets like I used to. He thanked me distractedly, the way one thanks a stranger for holding the elevator. The more I tried, the further he drifted. Sometimes, I'd catch him looking at me not with affection, but with guilt, the kind of guilt that comes from a man rehearsing an exit. And yet, I couldn't hate him. I still saw the man who once clung to life, terrified, who looked at me with tears in his eyes and whispered that he couldn't lose me. But that man was fading, and no amount of devotion could bring him back. One night, as the city slept, I sat alone in the darkened living room. The air smelled of disinfectant and lavender, clean but empty. The clock ticked softly, a rhythm against my ribs. I closed my eyes and thought about that moment in the hospital. The sterile light, his trembling hand in mine, the promise that we'd start over. Maybe the surgery didn't just change his body, it changed his soul. Maybe survival demands a kind of selfishness I'll never understand. The scar on my side had healed, but the one inside me was just beginning to open. Still, I held on. Because sometimes, when you've given so much, it feels impossible to stop giving. I told myself, if I'm patient, he'll come back. If I love him right, he'll remember who we were. But love built on sacrifice can easily become a quiet form of self-erasure. Each day, I felt a little less like his wife, and more like his donor, useful, necessary, but invisible. And somewhere in the stillness of that realization, a seed of doubt began to grow. It started small. The sound of his phone vibrating late at night. The way he'd step outside to answer, speaking in low tones. The scent of perfume that lingered on his jacket. The sudden new password on his laptop. I told myself it was nothing. I told myself love means trust. But trust without truth is only silence, and silence can suffocate. One evening, as we sat across from each other at dinner, I looked at him and thought, this man is alive because of me, and yet I've never felt so dead inside. He smiled at something on his phone again. I smiled too, pretending not to notice. Outside, the rain began to fall, slow and steady against the glass. And for the first time, I wasn't sure whether I wanted it to stop. That night, lying awake beside him, I realized something had shifted. I was no longer waiting for him to love me. I was waiting for myself to wake up. Because deep down, beneath the fear and the exhaustion, I could feel it. The peace I thought we had was only the stillness before the storm. And soon, everything we'd built, the house of glass, the promises, the quiet faith, would begin to crack. I didn't know it yet, but this fragile calm was already ending. And the woman who would rise from its ruins was not the same one who once whispered, "If my body can save you, take what you need." It was a Thursday evening when I found a silk scarf tucked carelessly in the passenger seat of Daniel's car. Pale beige, delicate, with a faint scent of jasmine and something powdery, too sweet to be mine. I held it for a moment between my fingers, as if it might tell me the truth on its own. When I asked him about it later, he didn't even flinch. He smiled, that same charming, confident smile that had once made me believe in him completely. "You're being paranoid," he said lightly. "After giving me your kidney, do you really want to control my breathing too?" The words were soft, almost teasing, but they sliced through me quietly, like a thin, invisible blade. That night, I didn't sleep. The house was silent, except for the ticking of the clock and the faint hum of the refrigerator, sounds that used to mean home but now felt like strangers whispering in another room. I could hear my own heartbeat, uneven, shallow, as if the organ I'd given away was trying to protest inside him, sensing something I hadn't wanted to see. In the dark, I thought of all the times I had defended him to my friends, to my own doubts. How many times had I told myself he was just tired, just distracted, just healing? Love had turned me into a translator of excuses, rewriting every absence into compassion. But something had changed in his eyes, an absence that no amount of devotion could fill. It wasn't anger I felt. Not yet. It was clarity, sharp and cold. The next day, I started to notice the patterns, the text messages he shielded from view, the meetings that ran too long, the sudden care with which he groomed himself, new cologne, expensive shirts, hair trimmed every week. He said he was networking, but his phone lit up at midnight with names I didn't recognize. When I asked simple questions, his answers were too quick, too clean, like lines rehearsed before a mirror. He'd smile, change the subject, and I'd let him. Because sometimes, when you fear the truth, pretending not to know feels easier than facing it. At work, his assistant had started calling the house more often. Lila. Her voice was always bright, casual, too familiar. Once, she left a message on the machine. "Hi, Daniel. Just confirming our dinner meeting tonight. I'll bring the files you asked for." Dinner meeting. The words echoed in my mind long after the line went dead. When he came home later that night, the scent of jasmine drifted past him again. I didn't ask. I simply watched him loosen his tie, his movements easy, unbothered. He had no idea I was memorizing everything, the tone of his voice, the way he avoided my eyes, the silence that stretched between us like a fault line. There's a moment, just before betrayal becomes undeniable, when the world tilts slightly. You start to see everything as evidence, the pause before an answer, the misplaced smile, the sudden kindness that feels like guilt. I began to move through our house like an observer. Each room held a ghost of who we used to be. Laughter in the kitchen, our reflection caught mid-dance in the hallway mirror, the dent in the sofa where we used to sit together on Sunday mornings. But those ghosts didn't belong to us anymore. They belonged to two people who no longer existed. One evening, he came home late again, the smell of wine clinging to his clothes. His tie was loose, his hair a little out of place. "Rough day?" I asked quietly. "You could say that," he said, avoiding my gaze as he poured himself another drink. I wanted to ask where he had been. I wanted to ask who he had been with. But instead, I just watched him, the man whose life I had saved, drinking, as if he were still trying to drown something inside him. He didn't notice the way my hands trembled, Or maybe he did and chose to ignore it. That night, I stood by the window and looked out at the city lights. Each one felt like a truth waiting to be discovered, a secret flickering in the distance. I whispered to myself, I gave him a part of my body, but why do I feel like I'm disappearing? I began to write again, small fragments of thoughts scattered in a notebook I kept hidden in the drawer. Day 142 after surgery. He smiled today, but not at me. Day 146. He said he was working late again. I didn't ask why. Silence feels safer than answers. Every page became a confession I couldn't say aloud. Sometimes, late at night, I'd wake to find his side of the bed empty. I'd hear faint footsteps downstairs, the sound of his voice carried through the walls. Soft, tender tones I hadn't heard directed at me in months. When I'd ask the next morning, he'd laugh, dismiss it, tell me I must have been dreaming. And maybe I had been. Maybe our entire marriage was a dream slowly unraveling, thread by thread. Maya called one evening, her voice firm but kind. Evelyn, are you sure he deserves all that faith? I didn't know how to answer her. Love makes you loyal to your own pain. I just need time, I said. Sometimes, she replied. Time isn't medicine. It's poison that works slowly. After we hung up, I sat in the dim light of the living room, her words still echoing. The shadows on the wall seemed to shift with every breath. In the following days, I watched Daniel grow lighter, almost radiant. He hummed while shaving, texted with a small smile, dressed better, moved with purpose. He was happy, and I wasn't the reason. I remember looking at him across the breakfast table, sunlight spilling over his face. It struck me then that he looked like a man who had fallen in love again. Only this time it wasn't with me. The realization didn't explode. It sank, quietly, into my chest like a slow, deliberate sinking of a stone into still water. That night, I couldn't bear the silence of our room. I slipped outside and sat on the porch steps. The air was cool, heavy with the smell of wet earth. Somewhere in the distance, a train passed, its whistle long and mournful. I pressed a hand against my side, feeling the faint throb beneath the scar. The organ I had given him was working inside his body, steady and strong, while my own heart stumbled inside my chest. It was almost poetic. I thought how life can keep beating in one place while dying in another. I wasn't angry, not yet. Anger requires certainty, and I was still living in the space between suspicion and denial. But something in me had shifted. The woman who once saw love as salvation was beginning to see it for what it had become, a quiet kind of cruelty wrapped in gratitude. When he kissed me goodnight, I didn't close my eyes. I just stood there, feeling the coldness of his lips and the weight of my own silence. And as he turned away, I realized that love can break you in the gentlest ways, without shouting, without violence, just an accumulation of small, deliberate absences. I didn't know how much longer I could pretend not to see, but I knew, deep down, that the truth was already waiting for me, just beneath the surface of that borrowed peace, ready to rise. It happened on my birthday. A date that used to mean warmth, laughter, and little surprises, a day when he would leave handwritten notes on the kitchen counter or show up at my work with flowers. But this year, the silence was heavy, deliberate, almost rehearsed. The morning came and went without a call. By evening, I set the table for two anyway, because hope is a stubborn thing. I lit a candle, waited, and watched the wax melt down to nothing. At 9, I called him. He answered on the second ring, his voice distant, like he was somewhere with too much background noise. "I'm at the gym," he said quickly. "Don't wait up, I'll be late." Something in his tone felt off, too sharp, too practiced, but I said nothing. I simply nodded into the phone and whispered, "Okay." After we hung up, I sat in the dark for a long while, the flame of the candle trembling in the draft. It was a fragile kind of loneliness, the kind that doesn't scream, just lingers like smoke in the chest. Near midnight, my phone buzzed. A message from an unknown number. "He's here, and he's not wearing his wedding ring." For a moment, I couldn't move. The words blurred before my eyes, rearranging themselves into something I didn't want to read again. My heart didn't race, it slowed, heavy and deliberate, as if bracing for an impact it already knew was coming. The address attached to the message was a hotel just 10 minutes away. I didn't think. I just went. The lobby was quiet, washed in golden light. My reflection stared back at me in the elevator doors, a woman pale and calm, too calm, like she'd already left her body. When the elevator opened on the 10th floor, I heard it before I saw it. Laughter, soft and unguarded, spilling into the hallway. It came from the room at the end, the one whose door was slightly ajar. I stopped there. The sound of him reached me first, his voice lower, warmer than it had been in months. Then came hers, light, playful, a tone I hadn't heard directed at me in a long time. Through the narrow gap I saw him. Daniel. The man whose life I had saved. He was standing close to her, one hand brushing her hair away from her face. His wrist was bare, no ring, no hesitation. They looked so at ease together, like two people untouched by consequence, by pain, by memory. He smiled the same smile he used to give me when we were still us. I didn't enter. I didn't speak. I just stood there, silent, watching the life I had built slip into the hands of someone else. And in that moment, I felt something shift inside me, not a break, but a quiet surrender. All the anger I should have felt dissolved into something colder, cleaner, clarity. He was alive because of me, yet standing there, I realized that love cannot be measured by sacrifice. You can give someone a second chance at life, and they might use it to destroy you. When I finally turned away, the hallway seemed endless. The carpet muffled my footsteps, the lights overhead flickered softly, and I could feel the weight of my own pulse echoing in my ears. Outside, the air was sharp and cold. I drove home with the windows down, as if the night could wash the truth from my skin. It didn't. It never does. At home, I walked into the bathroom and opened the cabinet. The old bottle of painkillers sat there, nearly full. I hadn't touched them in months. My hands shook as I opened it, not to take any, but to hold it, to remind myself what healing once felt like. Then I sat on the floor, knees pulled to my chest, and cried until morning. Not the kind of crying that releases you, but the kind that empties you, leaving only silence behind. When dawn finally came, it crept through the blinds like mercy. The house was still. I could hear the birds outside, the sound of the city waking up. But inside me, everything was quiet, too quiet. For the first time, I understood what it meant to lose yourself. Not just emotionally, but physically. To look down at your hands and not feel they belong to you. To breathe and not recognize the rhythm of your own body. The organ inside him, the one that had once been mine, was now working perfectly. And yet, I felt hollow, as if the part of me that gave him life had also taken mine away. That morning, I stood in front of the mirror. My face looked calm, almost peaceful, but my eyes were foreign. They belonged to a stranger who had finally seen the truth. I whispered to my reflection, "He carries my heart inside him, and yet, I'm the one who's dying." The woman staring back didn't flinch. She simply blinked once, slowly, as if acknowledging that something had ended and something else had quietly begun. I didn't tell anyone what I'd seen. Not Maya, not my mother, not even myself, not out loud. Words make things real, and I wasn't ready to give it that kind of power. Instead, I went about my days in silence. I smiled when people asked how I was. I went to work. I cooked dinner. I folded his clothes as if nothing had changed. But each time I touched one of his shirts, I thought of that hotel room, of her laughter, of his bare hand tracing someone else's skin. It was strange how betrayal didn't feel like an explosion. It was more like erosion, slow, patient, unstoppable. That night, lying beside him, I realized the distance between us was no longer emotional. It was physical, tangible. The man who once shared my heartbeat now felt like a stranger lying inches away, breathing my oxygen, carrying my kidney, but no longer sharing my life. He murmured something in his sleep, a name I didn't recognize. I turned to look at him, studying the curve of his jaw, the faint scar near his temple. He looked peaceful. I wondered if guilt ever woke him up the way grief woke me. As dawn stretched across the room, I pressed my palm against my side, tracing the faint scar beneath my nightgown. It pulsed softly, steady, alive, a reminder of what I had given and what I had lost. And for the first time I thought, maybe this pain wasn't punishment. Maybe it was a beginning. Because sometimes the truth doesn't destroy you. It simply shows you who you really are when there's nothing left to lose. He came home at sunrise. The light through the curtains was pale, unforgiving, the kind of light that reveals everything you've tried to hide. I heard the front door open, then close softly, as if he didn't want to wake me. But I was already awake. I had been awake all night, listening to the hum of the city, to the silence between us that had grown into a wall. When he stepped into the room, I smelled it first, the perfume. Not mine, sweet, heavy, familiar, jasmine. He didn't bother changing his shirt. He just stood there, looking at me, his face calm, rehearsed, distant. The man who once trembled in a hospital bed now looked almost serene. "Evelyn," he said quietly, "I think we're not right for each other anymore. I want a divorce." No anger, no guilt. Just the clean precision of someone cutting a cord he no longer needs. For a moment, I didn't move. My hands rested on the blanket, still and cold. I waited for my heart to shatter, but it didn't. It just slowed steady, deliberate. I thought of the night he begged me for a second chance at life. The way he cried, gripping my hand like a drowning man. Now that same hand, strong and healed, was signing away the life we'd built together. I looked at him and saw two versions of the same man. The one who had once been terrified of dying, and the one who now killed everything sacred between us without blinking. He waited for me to speak. Maybe he expected tears, a scream, a plea, but something in me had already gone quiet. The woman who had once fought for him, prayed for him, given him part of her body, she was gone. I smiled, though it didn't feel like mine. It felt like it belonged to someone older, someone who had already walked through fire. "All right," I said softly. "Consider this my final donation." He frowned. "What do you mean?" I met his eyes and said, "I gave you my kidney. I suppose it's only fair I give you the illusion that love could save you." He looked away first. His jaw tightened, but he said nothing. Maybe he thought my calmness was acceptance. Maybe he didn't realize that silence can hold more power than any scream. When he left the room, I sat there for a long time. The air felt heavier somehow, thick with the scent of his cologne and the ghost of a life I'd already begun to mourn. On the nightstand, the lamp was still on. I stared at its light, soft, steady, almost compassionate. I thought of all the nights I had watched over him, afraid his body would reject what I had given. Funny, I thought. His body had accepted my kidney perfectly. It was his soul that had done the rejecting. Later that evening, the house was silent. I made tea, poured it into a cup, and didn't drink it. I just watched the steam rise and fade, the same way our promises had. The word divorce didn't echo the way I thought it would. It didn't crash or break things. It simply lingered in the air, inevitable, almost merciful. I opened my journal, the same one I had kept since the surgery, and wrote slowly, each word deliberate. Day 427 after the transplant. The man who carries my kidney has decided to leave my body in a different way. I set the pen down and read it again. The sentence didn't make me cry. It made me still. That night, I walked through the house barefoot, touching the walls, the furniture, the little remnants of our life together, the framed photo from our wedding, the plant we bought the week he came home from the hospital, the book he never finished reading. Everything looked the same, yet nothing was. The silence was not empty. It was full of ghosts. I sat by the window and looked out at the streetlights flickering below. Somewhere out there, he was probably laughing, breathing easily, free. And I wondered if he ever thought about the cost of that freedom. Did he ever think of me when his chest rose and fell, when his body pulsed with the rhythm of the organ that used to be mine? Probably not. At some point, I stopped thinking of him as my husband. He was just a man now. A man who had borrowed a piece of me to keep living, only to return it in a form I no longer recognized. There's a kind of death that doesn't come from illness. It comes from indifference. And that morning, watching him speak so calmly, I realized I had been mourning him long before he said the words. When I finally went to bed, I didn't cry. I was too tired for that. Instead, I listened to the rhythm of my breathing, slow and fragile, as if relearning how to exist on my own. The pillow beside me was cold, untouched. I stared at it for a while and whispered, "You survived, Daniel. Congratulations." Then I turned off the light. For the first time in months, I didn't wait for the sound of his footsteps. And somewhere deep inside, beneath the scar and the ache, I felt the faintest pulse of something unfamiliar peace. Not the kind that comes from happiness, but the kind that arrives when you stop begging someone to stay. By morning, I knew what I needed to do. Not to fight, not to forgive, just to walk away with the quiet dignity of someone who has already given enough. I folded the divorce papers he had left on the counter and placed them in an envelope. My signature would come later. There was no rush. Some endings deserve silence, not ceremony. Then I stepped outside, into the pale light of dawn. The air was crisp, almost kind. For the first time, I felt the weight in my chest loosen. I had given him my kidney, my love, my faith. And now, I was giving him the one thing he could never take, my freedom. After Daniel moved out, the house felt like an echo. Every sound lingered longer than it should: the creak of the floor, the hum of the fridge, the soft thud of the mail against the door. It was strange how a place could look the same yet feel entirely hollow, as if its heart had been taken out. At first, I avoided going home. I'd stay late at work, linger in coffee shops, wander through grocery aisles with no intention of buying anything. Coming back to the emptiness felt like stepping into a museum of my own grief, every object a reminder of what had been lost. But grief, I learned, has its own rhythm. It starts loud, then softens. It fades not because you forget, but because you grow stronger around it. Each morning, I began to hear something new: my own heartbeat. It was steady, quiet, patient. I hadn't noticed it in a long time. I started walking in the mornings. At first, just a few blocks, then miles. The air in early spring was sharp and clean, the kind that fills your lungs and reminds you you're still here. The city moved around me, people rushing, buses hissing, life unfolding, and for the first time in months, I felt a small thread of connection to it all. There was peace in motion. Every step felt like reclaiming a piece of myself I'd given away. I planted flowers in the garden behind the house, a small act, but symbolic. Lavender, rosemary, and white lilies, things that could grow quietly, without asking for anything. Watching them bloom was like watching my own pulse return. One day, I joined a support group for organ donors. I didn't expect much. I only wanted to sit in a room where no one asked me to be strong. But the people there surprised me. A father who had given his kidney to his son, a sister who had saved her brother, a woman who, like me, had given hers to her husband, only to lose him to someone else afterward. Their stories weren't perfect, but there was a calmness in their eyes, a quiet acceptance that life doesn't always repay kindness the way we imagine. When it was my turn to speak, I hesitated. My voice trembled at first. I thought saving him would give my life meaning, I said. But I realize now meaning doesn't come from who we save. It comes from what we learn about ourselves afterward. Someone in the room nodded. Someone else smiled through tears. For the first time, I didn't feel alone in the space between love and loss. A few weeks later, Dr. Harris stopped by the hospital where I worked. He had been there the day of the transplant, the one who guided me through the pain, who watched me sign the consent form with trembling hands. He looked at me for a long moment, then said quietly, "Evelyn, maybe that kidney didn't just save Daniel. Maybe it saved you from forgetting that you deserve to live too." The words landed softly, but they rooted deep. That night, I stood by the window, watching the streetlights blink through the rain. I thought about what it meant to be alive, not for someone, not because of someone, but for myself. For years, I had measured my worth by how much I could give. Now I was learning to measure it by how gently I could heal. When the day finally came to sign the divorce papers, I didn't wear black or gray like I thought I would. I wore white. A quiet kind of white, the color of clean pages, of beginnings. I carried a small bouquet of white flowers, nothing extravagant, just something living to hold on to. The courthouse smelled of paper and coffee, ordinary and human. I signed my name slowly, carefully, as if tracing the outline of a new life. No tears came. Not one. Only a breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding for years. When I stepped outside, the sky had turned soft and gray. A light rain began to fall, not a storm, just a gentle drizzle that blurred the world into watercolor. I didn't rush for cover. I just stood there, feeling the drops touch my skin, cool and clean. For so long I had been afraid of the rain. It reminded me of the night he left me in it to teach me a lesson. Now, standing beneath it again, I finally understood. The rain wasn't punishment, it was release. I tilted my head back, closed my eyes, and let the sky wash over me. "You took my kidney," I whispered into the mist, "but you will never have my soul." The words didn't feel bitter. They felt like truth. When I opened my eyes, the world looked new. Cars passed, people hurried by, umbrellas bloomed and disappeared, but none of it felt heavy anymore. My heart was light. My steps were sure. I walked away from the courthouse without looking back. The pavement shimmered beneath my feet, each drop of rain a small promise that life would grow again, even from pain. For the first time in years, I didn't feel like someone who had lost everything. I felt like someone who had survived herself and found peace in the ruins. Later that night, I wrote one final line in my journal, day 512 after the transplant. "The man who carried my kidney is gone, but the woman who gave it to him has finally come home." I closed the book, turned off the light, and smiled a quiet, genuine smile that belonged only to me. Because freedom, I realized, doesn't come when they leave. It comes when you finally decide to stay with yourself. 3 years have passed. Time, I've learned, doesn't erase pain. It teaches it to speak a different language. The ache is still there, quiet and distant, like an old song playing in another room. But now, when I hear it, I no longer flinch. I listen, and I smile. I founded a small organization called The Second Heart. It began as a modest idea, just a few women meeting once a week to talk, to breathe, to heal. Now it's grown into a foundation that helps women who have been abused, abandoned, or betrayed after giving too much of themselves to others. We don't teach revenge. We teach rebirth. At our gatherings, I tell my story not to reopen wounds, but to remind others that pain can be the soil where strength grows. I speak of the surgery, the betrayal, the silence, and finally, the freedom. And when I finish, there's always someone who cries softly, not out of pity, but recognition. They understand. Because all of us, in one way or another, have given away pieces of ourselves to someone who never deserved them. Maya is still by my side, my anchor, my reminder of truth spoken in love. After one of my talks, she pulled me aside and asked, "If you could go back, Evelyn, would you still give him your kidney?" I thought about it, about the sleepless nights, the tears, the scar. Then I smiled. "Yes," I said, "because I didn't do it for him. I did it to stay human, to prove that kindness doesn't lose its worth just because someone misused it." She looked at me for a moment, then nodded. And in that silence, I knew she understood. Sometimes, after the session's end, I walk onto the empty stage and stand under the soft lights. The microphone hums faintly, the air thick with stories that have been released and redeemed. When the cameras roll, I look into the lens and say, I used to think love meant giving everything away, but real love is knowing what to keep. So you can keep living, even after love is gone. The audience always grow quiet. Then someone claps, softly at first, then louder, until the whole room joins in. Now, when I look in the mirror, I no longer see the woman who gave too much. I see a survivor, calm, steady, and whole. The scar on my side no longer feels like a wound. It feels like a reminder. Life grows where we once thought everything had ended. Outside, it's raining again. I open the window and let the scent of wet earth drift in. "You took my kidney," I whisper to the memory of him, "but my soul was never yours to keep." I close the window, turn off the light, and breathe. Forgiveness isn't about making someone else feel lighter, it's about freeing yourself. When we give away a part of our body, our heart, or our trust, it doesn't mean we've lost everything. If love is betrayed, it only leaves the body. The soul where kindness lives blooms again, under another name, freedom.